All right, so we're diving into Will Durant's The Story of Philosophy.
Yeah.
And you've given us all these excerpts. And
Right.
it seems like you're after more than just like what these guys thought. You want like the historical context and like why it still matters today.
Well, I mean, Durant himself, he was really interested in connecting those dots, right? Like, he saw philosophy as this living conversation,
Oh, right.
not just something that's stuck in, like, ivory towers and dusty books.
Yeah.
And he had this way of weaving together history, culture, these big personalities to show that philosophy is actually about these, like, really human questions that we're still grappling with.
And he starts out, like right off the bat, talking about this problem of specialization,
Right.
which is so relevant. It's like he could see the future. Everyone's like an expert in this tiny little thing. And how do you even like...
Yeah, and you end up with this situation where you know more and more about less and less.
Exactly.
And it can be really hard to see the bigger picture.
Yeah, and Durant's point is that this isn't just some like academic debate. This
Right.
actually has real world consequences.
Exactly. I mean, he argues that when we have this gap between specialized knowledge
Yeah.
and like everyday life, that's when things like superstition, misinformation, they kind of creep in.
It's like we're all kind of drowning in information, but we're not really any wiser for it.
Yes, exactly. And, it's interesting because his own book, The Story of Philosophy,
Right.
it was a huge hit.
It was.
People loved it.
Yeah.
And I think it's because he tapped into this hunger for knowledge,
Yeah.
but presented it in a way that was engaging and accessible, right?
Totally, because it can be kind of intimidating to even approach some of these big philosophical texts.
Oh, absolutely.
Just like breaking it down.
Yeah, he's like your approachable guy
Right.
to this world of big ideas.
Yeah, he's like the people's philosopher.
Exactly.
So instead of just getting like a dry lecture, we get to see these philosophers as like real people.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
flaws and quirks and everything.
Absolutely. And Durant does such a good job of bringing those personalities to life.
So who are we going to meet? Give us a little preview. Who are some of the characters in this story?
Well, we've got to start with the OG himself, Socrates.
Right.
Durant describes him as this unassuming kind of guy, but with this charisma
Okay.
that could make anyone stop and think. So imagine this. Socrates hanging out in the marketplace, just peppering people with questions,
Oh, boy.
forcing them to examine their beliefs.
Yeah.
It's like he invented, like, street corner philosophy.
I like it.
Yeah.
He's like the original philosophical provocateur.
Exactly.
And what about Plato?
Ah, Plato.
I remember reading The Republic in college, or trying to.
Right.
So how does he come to life in Durant's telling?
Well, Durant paints this picture of Plato as this brilliant, idealistic thinker
Okay.
trying to design the perfect society. We've got philosopher kings, this strict social hierarchy.
Right.
It's fascinating stuff and kind of controversial, but it raises these really timeless questions
Like what?
about power, about justice, about who should rule.
Oh, so we're getting into it.
We're getting into it.
This isn't just like a history lesson.
No, not
We're
at
actually
all.
going to like grapple with some big questions.
Oh, really?
So what's the overall like takeaway you want listeners to get from this whole deep dive?
I think what Durant reminds us is that philosophy, it's not just some dusty old subject.
Yeah.
It's a living conversation that's still totally relevant to the challenges that we face today.
So what does it mean to like live philosophically, especially in a world that's like, we said drowning in information,
Right.
but maybe not so much wisdom? I'm ready to unpack this.
Let's do it.
Okay, so we've met Socrates, the philosophical gadfly, and Plato, the architect of an ideal society. It's like Durant's taking us on a guided tour through history, revealing these iconic figures not just as thinkers, but as real people.
And it's fascinating to see how their personal journeys shaped their ideas. Durant brings this point home when he talks about Aristotle, Plato's star pupil. He wasn't just a philosopher, he was a scientist, an observer of the natural world.
He was like a Renaissance man before there was a Renaissance. He studied everything from plants and animals to physics and ethics. He was like, let's get down to the nitty-gritty of the universe.
And Durant describes his approach to philosophy as grounded, almost practical. Aristotle believed in observation, experimentation, and logic. He was all about finding the golden mean, the sweet spot between extremes.
I love that idea. It's like the just right Goldilocks principle for living life. Not too much, not too little, but just the right amount.
It's like finding that balance between being too courageous and being too reckless, or being too generous and being too extravagant. It's about finding virtue in the middle ground.
He also had some interesting ideas about politics. I remember reading about his concept of a mixed constitution where you balance different forms of government to prevent tyranny. It's like a recipe for stability and harmony.
And that's exactly what Durant highlights. He shows how Aristotle believed that a combination of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy could create a strong and just society. It's a concept that's still relevant today, especially in countries with complex political systems.
It's amazing how these thinkers from centuries ago can still speak to us with such relevance. It's like they're saying, hey, we were wrestling with these same questions, and our insights might still be useful for you.
And Durant isn't afraid to introduce us to more controversial figures like Spinoza, who saw God as inseparable from nature, or Voltaire, who challenged religious dogma and fought for freedom of expression.
It's like Durant is saying, look, these philosophers weren't always in agreement, but they were all trying to make sense of the world and find meaning in it. It's almost like a philosophical symphony, with each thinker adding their unique voice to the conversation.
And that's what's so captivating about Durant's The Story of Philosophy. He doesn't just present a dry academic overview. He brings these ideas to life with vivid stories and engaging personalities. He shows us that these thinkers were real people grappling with real issues and that their insights can still resonate with us today.
So let's dive a little deeper into the world of these controversial figures. What's the next stop on our tour of philosophical history? So we've gone from like the marketplaces of ancient Athens to like the Enlightenment salons with Voltaire.
Right.
It's amazing to see how these ideas kind of echo through the centuries, you know?
Yeah, what's wild is how some of these debates are still going on today.
Totally. Like we were talking about Spinoza,
Right.
seeing God as like inseparable from nature, which was pretty radical for the time. But then you have Voltaire coming in
Right.
with his wit and like challenging dogma and fighting for free speech.
Exactly. And it's like they're having this philosophical duel across centuries. And Durant doesn't shy away from some of the like darker, more pessimistic voices either.
Yeah, like who are we talking about?
Well, Schopenhauer, for example.
Oh, boy.
He was not afraid to say what a lot of people might have been thinking, but didn't necessarily want to say out loud.
Like what?
Well, he saw life as basically this constant struggle against suffering,
Ugh.
full of dissatisfaction, driven by this kind of blind, relentless will.
Okay, so that's a pretty heavy dose of reality.
Right.
So how does Durant like balance these different perspectives?
That's a good question because it can feel overwhelming.
It can. Like, is philosophy just a bunch of smart people arguing?
Well, and that's where Durant is so good. He's not saying these philosophers had all the answers,
Hey.
but by showing their disagreements, their different approaches, it highlights just how complex these questions really are.
Yeah, it's like the journey matters more than the destination.
Exactly.
It's more about the process of thinking critically.
Absolutely. And Durant's really encouraging that. He wants you to question things, to challenge the assumptions, even of these like big names in philosophy.
To form your own conclusions.
Exactly. He wants us to engage actively with these ideas, not just passively accept them.
So where does that leave us? I mean, we've covered so much ground.
Right.
And all these amazing thinkers.
We've been on quite the journey.
We have. So
Yeah.
what's the final takeaway? What's that nugget of wisdom Durant wants us to carry with us?
I think it comes down to this idea. It's not enough to just have information.
Right. We've got plenty of that.
We're drowning in it, right?
Yeah.
But Durant challenges us to go deeper, to search for meaning, to synthesize that knowledge into something that can actually guide us.
So it's less about being a walking encyclopedia of philosophy.
Yes.
And more about like living philosophically.
Exactly. It's a way of being in the world
It's about asking the big questions.
and not being afraid to grapple with the answers or the lack of easy answers.
And honestly, I think that's what's so exciting about philosophy. It's an ongoing conversation.
It never ends.
It doesn't. And that's what makes it so fascinating.
And who knows, maybe this is just the beginning of your own philosophical adventures.
There you go. That's the spirit.